Gideon Vane pulled down the brim of his Stetson, stopping the snow that was starting to fall hard from getting down his collar. His horse, Bones, snorted softly, its breath creating thick white clouds in the thin Bitterroot air. Montana in November was a merciless butcher. The cold here seeped through his worn leather jacket, reminding Gideon of man's insignificance in this harsh, high country. He stopped his horse on an overhanging rock ledge. This should have been a quiet afternoon, but the wind brought a scent that didn't belong in nature. Gideon took a deep breath, his icy hazel eyes narrowing. It wasn't the smell of pine wood burning in a fireplace, nor the smell of dry grass being burned to clear a field. It was a smell of kerosene mixed with the smell of rotting fabric and melting wood resin, the smell of a man-made structure being forced to burn. He spurred his horse downhill. Bones stepped cautiously on the jagged frozen ground. As he passed a stand of old pine trees, the Miller farmstead came into view in a scene of chaos. Thick black smoke rose from the main house, obscuring even the fading sunlight. 3 men were standing in the yard. They wore dark dusters, their left arms bearing a red armband with a white star, the symbol of the Northern Star Company. A big fellow with an oil-stained beard was using an axe to smash the reinforced window panes. The other 2 stood by an empty kerosene drum, casually rolling cigarettes as they listened to the desperate banging and screams from inside the burning house. "Hurry up," the bearded guy barked at his cohorts. "The old man inside is stubborn as a mule. Don't let him get the back door open in time." "It's dead bolted, boss," one replied, twirling a large iron padlock in his hand. "Mr. Nash ordered that the records have to be clean, so the house has to burn." Gideon silently slid off his horse. He didn't draw his gun immediately. He pulled out the tomahawk tucked at his hip, walking softly like a ghost on the snow. He didn't have the habit of warning enemies with words when they were busy with crime. The bearded guy was the first to notice something wrong. He turned around, still holding the axe, but what he saw wasn't a weak farmer, but a man with a scarred face, eyes frighteningly empty. "Hold it right there," Gideon said, his voice flat as a frozen lake. "Who the hell are you? Northern Star business? Beat it if you don't want to eat lead," the bearded guy roared, dropping the axe to reach for the gun at his hip. Bang! Gideon was faster. The bullet from the Colt single-action army slammed straight into the bearded guy's thigh. He collapsed like a felled tree, his scream tearing through the air. His 2 accomplices startled, but before they could draw their guns from their holsters, Gideon had moved. He spun, pulling the trigger twice more. One guy, hit in the shoulder, was knocked backward. The other, the one holding a lock, stood stunned as the muzzle of Gideon's gun pressed against the center of his forehead. "The key," Gideon repeated. No screaming, no threatening, just a cold technical request. The henchman tremblingly pulled out the ring of keys. Gideon snatched them, kicked him hard, sending him tumbling, then rushed toward the main door, which was engulfed in flames. The heat hit his face, acrid. He inserted the key, turned it hard. The door burst open, a rush of black smoke surging out like a trapped monster. Inside, a middle-aged man was collapsing on the floor, holding a young woman tight. Gideon rushed in. Without a word, he grabbed the man by the belt and pushed the girl toward the door. "Run! Get to the yard, now!" Gideon helped the man out just before a section of the roof collapsed, creating a shower of glowing red embers. When everyone had escaped outside, the young woman collapsed into the snow, breathing in the cold air to soothe her burning throat. That was Cassidy Miller. Despite her face smeared with soot, her green eyes still burned with an intense hatred. She looked at her unconscious father, then at the stranger. Gideon stood there, tall and towering in the middle of the burning farmyard. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were still fixed on the 3 henchmen groaning in the snow. "Why?" Cassidy wheezed, her voice broken. "Why did you help us?" Gideon didn't answer that emotional question. He walked over to the bearded guy, clutching his thigh. He flipped him over with the toe of his boot, then reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a neat stack of papers. Gideon glanced over the contents. It was a Bitterroot County foreclosure notice, but the dates had been crudely altered. The signature at the bottom was Vanderbilt Nash's. "Notice is dated 6 weeks ago," Gideon said, showing the paper to Cassidy. "While you guys said they only owed 2 days. A dirty trick. You're a dead man," the bearded guy hissed through his teeth. "Mr. Nash will hang you from the town's utility pole." Gideon looked at him, then quietly picked up their guns, emptied the bullets, and threw the guns into the burning fire. He turned back to Cassidy. "Can you ride?" Cassidy nodded, wiping a soot smear from her cheek. "I can. But my father, he's not conscious." Gideon looked towards Bones. The henchman shot in the shoulder had crawled out of sight some time ago. He would soon be back with an army. "Get him on my horse," Gideon ordered. "This fire will lead them. We got to move now." Cassidy looked at her house one last time, the place that held 10 years of her and her father's hard labor, now nothing but a pile of glowing red ashes. She didn't cry. The pain had turned into a sudden hardness. She looked at Gideon's broad back. He wasn't a knight. He was a survivor, and right now that was all she needed. Gideon lifted Cassidy's father, placing him across the saddle. He checked his gun again, loading bright copper bullets. "Let's go," he said curtly. The snow fell heavier, covering the fresh blood traces in the yard. Gideon led the horse on foot ahead, breaking a trail through the deep snow. He didn't speak another word, nor did he comfort the girl walking behind. He was simply doing a job instinct demanded. The oil lamps glowing from the windows of Bitterroot looked like amber eyes standing watch in the blizzard. Gideon led Bones onto the main thoroughfare, where sturdy red brick buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, a stark contrast to the desolate, ruined outskirts. The dry thud of hooves on the wooden boardwalk cut through the thick air of a town that was sleeping but on edge. Cassidy walked tight against the horse's flank, her hand gripping the saddle to steady her still unconscious father. Her face was pale from the cold, but her green eyes flashed every time a shadow moved under a porch. Bitterroot wasn't the safe haven she once knew. Now every street corner reeked of money and double crosses. Gideon stopped in front of a blacksmith shop with the dangling sign, Miller and Son. This was home. He lifted Mr. Miller down, his movements decisive but careful enough not to aggravate the head wound. Cassidy quickly unlocked the door, and the lingering warmth from the forge drifted out, cutting through the lethal Montana chill. "Put him on the bed in there," Cassidy said, pointing toward the small room behind the forge. Gideon complied. After laying the man down, he turned to watch Cassidy. She was frantically searching for bandages and hard liquor. Her hands were shaking, whether from the cold or the fear finally sinking in after the shock had worn off. "Move aside," Gideon said, his voice low. He took the bottle, soaked a clean rag, and began dabbing the dry blood from Mr. Pearl. Miller's forehead. "The wound isn't deep, but he needs peace and quiet." Cassidy stood still, watching him. The way Gideon handled the injury, fast, precise, and cold, showed he'd done this 100 times, likely on his own hide, or on fallen comrades. She stepped closer, her breath coming out in a thin mist. "Who are you, Gideon Vane?" she asked, her voice so soft it was nearly drowned out by the wind whistling through the door cracks. "A stranger doesn't just show up in Bitterroot without a reason. You're no cowpoke, and you sure as hell aren't a minor." Gideon paused, looking into the young woman's eyes. Her curiosity grated on him. He'd spent half his life running from questions, trying to be a ghost without a past. "I'm just passing through," he replied, stowing the bottle and standing up. "And you should worry more about staying vertical than knowing my name. That henchman who got away has definitely already chirped to Vanderbilt Nash." Cassidy bit her lip, a stubborn look taking hold of her face. "I know Nash. He's got everyone in his pocket, from the yellow-bellied sheriff to the county clerk. But why burn us out? My father always paid his taxes on time. We don't owe the bank a red cent." Gideon pulled the forge foreclosure papers from his pocket and tossed them onto a soot-covered wooden table. "He doesn't need you to owe him. He just needs your land to sit on the copper vein map he wants to tap. These papers say your family defaulted 6 weeks ago. In Nash's world, the truth is just something you can fix with ink and a bribed seal." Cassie picked up the paper, her hand shaking even harder as she saw Nash's signature. "That son of a bitch." "Get some shut-eye," Gideon said, walking back toward the forge. He found a dark corner, sat down, and began wiping the snow off his iron. The next morning, Bitterroot woke up under a mask of fake peace. Gideon left Cassidy to tend to her father and headed for the center of town, where the Northern Star Company building stood like a gray stone fortress. He passed rows of fancy shops where ladies in expensive silk dresses looked at him with disgust because of his ragged clothes and scarred face. Gideon didn't give a damn. He was used to being seen as a monster. Vanderbilt Nash's office was on the top floor. When Gideon walked in, Nash's secretary, a groomed young man, tried to block his path. "Mr. Nash doesn't take walk-ins, sir." He looked Gideon up and down and curled his lip. "If that's even what you are." Gideon didn't say a word. He grabbed the secretary by the collar, hoisted him up, and slammed him into the double oak doors behind him. The doors burst open with a crash that echoed through the hallway. Inside, Vanderbilt Nash sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He was in his late 40s, hair slicked back, wearing a suit so fine he looked more like a scholar than a land grabber. Nash looked up, his gray eyes showing no surprise or fear. He set down his quill and calmly laced his fingers together. "I assume you're the one who ruined my employee's afternoon," Nash said, his voice smooth and refined. A striking face. Was it the war or a barroom scrap? Gideon stepped closer, throwing the fake foreclosure notice on the desk, right on top of Nash's clean files. "Rotten to the core," Gideon said curtly. "I want to know how many families got one of these before their houses turned to ash." Nash gave a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Son, you're in Montana. Out here, the law belongs to the men who know how to run it. People like the Millers don't know how to make their land turn a profit. I'm just doing some necessary pruning to bring prosperity to Bitterroot by burning houses and killing folks." "Those were just hiccups in the process," Nash shrugged. "What do you want? Money? A man like you has a price. Name it, and I'll pay you double what you make in a year to turn your horse around and get the hell out of this county." Gideon looked Nash dead in the eye. "I'm not for sale to the likes of you. I'm just taking back what belongs to others." Nash sighed, looking disappointed. He tapped his fingers on the desk. "A pity. You got the skills, but you're too much of a romantic. In this country, romantics usually end up in unmarked graves." Just then, the office door swung open again. Bitterroot County Sheriff Silas Reed, a pot-bellied man with a silver star that was shiny but rusted at the edges, walked in with two deputies. Reed looked at Gideon with pure spite. "Don't move an inch, Bane," Reed barked, hand hovering over his holster. "I got reports of you assaulting Northern Star staff and disturbing the peace. You're under arrest." Gideon didn't flinch. He knew this was a setup. He slowly raised his hands, but not to surrender. He was checking the draw on his Colt. The air in the office went thick with tension, like a powder keg waiting for a spark. "He murdered my men, Sheriff," Nash added, his voice dripping with hypocrisy. "I'm afraid Bitterroot can't tolerate this kind of dangerous criminal." "Move it." Reed stepped forward, reaching for his cuffs. Crash. The large office window shattered. A Winchester round tore through the air, slamming into the wooden frame inches from Silas Reed's head. The sheriff scrambled back, falling on his ass. Down on the street, Cassidy Miller stood on a wooden wagon, her rifle still smoking. She shouted, her voice echoing through the town, "Let him go, Silas. Unless you want all of Bitterroot to know about the fake papers in your pocket." Cassidy's sudden appearance turned the tables. A crowd began to gather below, whispering. Nash frowned, his confidence cracking for the first time. He looked out the window, then at Gideon, who was still standing calm in the middle of the room. "Seems you found yourself a loud ally," Nash said coldly. Gideon didn't answer. He took advantage of the chaos, spun around, and kicked one of Reed's deputies hard in the knee before lunging for the balcony. He vaulted over the railing onto the porch roof below, rolled, and hit the ground right next to Cassidy's wagon. "Get in," Cassidy yelled, already levering another round. Gideon jumped onto the wagon. She snapped the reins, and the team of horses bolted through the snow, leaving Silas Reed scrambling to his feet and Vanderbilt Nash watching with a murderous gaze from above. "Are you out of your mind going in there alone?" Cassidy shouted as she drove, her breath coming fast from a mix of adrenaline and fear. "He owns this whole town." "I just wanted to see his true face," Gideon replied, wiping a small speck of blood from his cheek, where a glass shard had nipped him. "And you're just as crazy opening fire in broad daylight." Cassidy flashed a quick, proud smile. "They took my home. I've got nothing left to lose." They raced toward the tree line, where the old pines would hide them from the town. Cassidy stole a glance at Gideon every now and then. In that confrontation, she'd seen a different Gideon. Not just a cold bounty hunter, but a man willing to walk into the lion's den for a justice he kept claiming he didn't care about. The 19-year-old girl's crush was taking deeper root, even though she knew the man beside her carried a winter in his heart colder than any Montana storm. "Where are we headed?" Cassidy asked as the wagon slowed. "The county archives," Gideon replied, eyes scanning their back trail. If Nash wants the land, he had to leave a paper trail in the old records. "We need to find the others he pruned, just like your family." The wagon pulled up in the deep shadows of the pines surrounding the old Bitterroot County archives. It was a low-slung stone structure, tucked away from the bustling town center, where stacks of land titles from the homesteading days lay dormant under layers of dust. Gideon hopped down first, hand resting on his holster, eyes sweeping the surrounding brush. Cassidy followed him down, her breath still hitched. She looked at the building, then back at Gideon, who was checking the action on his Colt. "Why here?" Cassidy whispered. "Nash said he holds the law. If there was proof against him, he'd have burned it long ago. He can buy men, but he can't scrub every stain off of bureaucracy," Gideon replied, stepping toward the door. "The enemy of men like Nash isn't a gun, it's the logic of numbers. He needs digits to make his land grab look legal, and those numbers have to sit somewhere." He pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old parchment, dried ink, and stone-cold dampness. Amidst towering wooden shelves packed with ledger boxes sat a small desk, with a flickering oil lamp. Seated there was a frail, elderly man, his thick spectacles sliding down his nose. His name was Elias, a clerk who had spent 30 years filing away the lives of Bitterroot through land deeds. Elias looked up, his eyes widening at the scar on Gideon's face and the rifle in Cassidy's hand. He moved to stand, but Gideon held up a hand to keep him seated. "We aren't here to kick up a fuss, Elias," Gideon said, stepping closer. "We're here for the folks who went missing." Elias trembled, his bony hands interlacing. I'm just the gatekeeper. I don't know anything, Mr. Nash ordered the files for the South Valley sealed, which is exactly why we need to see him," Gideon said, pulling out a gold coin and set it lightly on the desk. 15 households, all in the path of that copper vein. Show me their original deeds." Elias looked at the gold, then at the iron resolve in Gideon's eyes. He sighed, the weariness of a lifetime spent in fear showing on his face. He stood and limped toward the back shelves. 10 minutes of rooting around later, he returned with a dust-covered stack of files. Gideon and Cassidy began flipping through the pages. Cassidy wasn't much for bookkeeping, but she recognized the names of her old neighbors. The Higgins, the O'Sheas, the Sterlings. All names that once filled church pews, only to vanish, following rumors they'd sold out to head east. "Look at this." Gideon pointed to a small line at the bottom of the Higgins deed. The foreclosure was signed September 12th, but the notice sent to the owner is dated the 15th. Legally, they lost their land 3 days before they even knew they owed a dime. And here, Cassidy added, her fingers shaking as she pointed to another file. "This is Mr. Sterling's signature. I know his hand. This isn't it. The script is too smooth, like it was practiced." Elias suddenly spoke up, his voice cracking. "They didn't head east, Miss Miller. None of 'em left Bitterroot by rail. I checked the station manifests. But they just dropped off the map." Gideon slammed the ledger shut. His gaze went dark. "They didn't drop off. Nash doesn't leave witnesses for future lawsuits. Once the land was his, he had to make sure the old owners never came back for justice." "You mean?" Cassidy trailed off, her face turning ghost white. "Deep in the northern star shafts," Gideon said, his voice cold as ice. "That's the best place to hide bodies no one's looking for." The room fell into a deathly silence. Cassidy felt a chill run down her spine. The truth about Vanderbilt Nash wasn't just greed, it was pure bloodlust. She looked at Gideon and saw him staring at a plat map. In that moment she felt small and alone, yet desperate to lean on the stranger. They left the archives once total darkness had set in. The snow was falling heavier now, masking the wagon's tracks. Gideon led Cassidy and her father, who had regained consciousness, but was still weak, to a rock cave hidden behind Echo Canyon. It was a hideout he'd scouted earlier. Inside the cave, a small fire danced, casting jagged shadows on the stone walls. Cassidy sat by the flames, a worn wool blanket draped over her shoulders. She watched Gideon double-checking the dynamite he'd liberated from her father's forge. "Gideon," she called softly. He didn't look up. "You ought to get some shut-eye. Tomorrow's going to be a long haul." "Why are you doing all this?" Cassidy asked, not letting him dodge it this time. "You don't have land here. You didn't even have a bone to pick with Nash until yesterday. A man like you, why take on an empire for strangers?" Gideon paused. He looked into the fire, his hazel eyes reflecting the flickering light, appearing deep and haunted. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I had a home once, Cassidy, down in Texas. A small spread, a wife and a daughter just turning 5. Cassidy held her breath. This was the first time he'd peeled back the curtain on his past. "I was a young buck back then, cocky with a gun. Thought I could protect them with lead. But when the land grabbers came, they didn't use Colts. They used fire while we were sleeping. I made it out. They didn't." He stopped, his hand gripping the gun stock so hard his knuckles turned white. "I spent 10 years hunting those men down, but the more I killed, the more I realized their deaths didn't bring my kin back. I couldn't save my own house, but I can keep others from burning." Cassidy stepped closer, resting a hand on his rugged arm. "It wasn't your fault, Gideon. That's on the wicked." Gideon looked down at her hand, then at the face of the 19-year-old girl, full of hope and affection. He saw a light in her eyes he'd lost a long time ago. A fire, a belief in love and redemption. "Cassidy," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He slowly removed her hand. "Don't go catching feelings for a man who died inside a long time ago. I'm a ghost, and ghosts don't stick around. Once this is settled, I'm hitting the trail." Cassidy felt her heart tighten. A dull ache spread through her chest. She wanted to scream that she didn't care who he was, that she'd follow him to the ends of the earth. But the coldness in Gideon's eyes cut her off. He wasn't just protecting her from Nash. He was protecting her from himself, a man he believed brought nothing but ruin. "I don't need you to be a hero," she said, her voice trembling. "I just need you to be Gideon." He didn't answer. He stood up and walked to the cave entrance to stand guard. Cassidy sat alone by the dying fire, feeling the Montana winter seeping into her very soul. The silence of the black night was suddenly shattered by the gallop of hooves and distant barking. Gideon pressed his ear to the ground, his face tightening into a mask of pure tension. "The jig is up," he said, drawing his Winchester. "That hired hand I winged this morning, he's got a hound." From down the valley, flickering torches began to appear, weaving through the trees like a fire snake crawling up the mountain. Vanderbilt Nash had unleashed his heavy hitters, the most notorious bounty hunters in the high plains, men paid to never quit until the prey was stretched out. Gideon looked at Cassidy, then at her elderly father lying in a stupor. He knew they couldn't run forever. This cave, once a sanctuary, was now a death trap. "Cassidy, take this." He handed her his spare sidearm. "You get your father deep into that rock crevice in the back. I'm gonna hold the line at the mouth." "No, I'm fighting with you. Listen to me." Gideon grabbed her shoulders, his eyes blazing under the light of the closing torches. "Now ain't the time to be pig-headed. If I go down, you're the only one who can get those files to the feds. You have to live, for the Millers and for everyone buried under that copper mine." Cassidy looked at him, tears welling up, but she wiped them away fast. She understood it was time to grow up, once and for all. She nodded, gripping the gun tight. Gideon turned back to the entrance, his silhouette long against the white snow. The blizzard began to howl, the wind screaming like a demon. The bounty hunters were at the foot of the canyon. Gideon raised his rifle, taking a deep breath to steady his heart. A deafening blast rang out, tearing through the thick shroud of snow. The bullet grazed the rock face right next to Gideon's head, leaving a small streak of fire and the acrid stench of scorched stone. The bounty hunters had closed in on the cave mouth, hunkering down behind pine stands and large limestone boulders. Their torches wavered in the screeching wind, casting dancing ghosts against the whiteout. "Vane, step out here and we can end this quick," a gravelly voice barked from downslope. "Nash just wants the files. Hand 'em over and the girl gets to live." Gideon didn't offer a word. He pressed himself flat against the cold stone floor, his Winchester leveled at a glimmer of light peeking from behind a tree trunk. He held his breath, waiting for his heart rate to steady amidst the bone-chilling cold. Bang! The light snuffed out along with a gut-wrenching scream. Gideon didn't stay to check his work. He immediately rolled to his right just before a volley from at least 3 other guns chewed up the spot where he'd been lying. Inside the cave, Cassidy was straining to haul her father into a narrow rock crevice in the back. Hearing the relentless gunfire, her heart constricted. She watched Gideon's silhouette reflected on the cave walls, a lonely shadow, steady but full of grim resignation. A stray bullet ricocheted inside, smashing into an old wooden crate and sending splinters flying. Cassidy let out a small shriek, her hand tightening around the sidearm Gideon had given her. "Cassidy, stay put," Gideon roared without looking back. He tossed a small jug of kerosene down the rocky slope and squeezed the trigger the second it hit the ground. A ghastly blue flame erupted in the blizzard, illuminating the faces of 4 gunmen trying to flank them. For a moment, chaos took hold of the attackers as the fire blinded them. Gideon seized the window, firing 4 shots in rapid succession. 2 men folded, bright red blood soaking the fresh powder. However, Nash's hired guns weren't greenhorns. The leader, a towering man with a scar across his jaw, used the covering fire to hug the left side of the cave. He tossed a homemade black powder grenade into the entrance. "Get down!" Gideon lunged toward Cassidy, using his body to shield her and Mr. Miller. An earth-shattering explosion shook the mountainside. Dirt and rock crumbled from the ceiling, and thick dust choked their vision. Cassidy's ears rang. She felt the weight of Gideon on top of her, smelling of gunpowder and cold sweat. As the smoke cleared, she saw Gideon staggering to his feet, blood seeping from a cut on his forehead and stinging his vengeful hazel eyes. "You're hit," Cassidy wheezed, reaching out to touch him. Gideon brushed her hand away, the flash of concern in his eyes instantly snuffed out by the brutal reality. "I'm fine. Get deeper inside. The back canyon exit, you remember it. I'm not leaving you," Cassidy hissed through clenched teeth, her usual stubbornness now hardened into reckless resolve. She crawled to his side, hefting her father's Winchester. Gideon looked at her for a heartbeat, a second that held everything he wanted to say but couldn't. He knew he couldn't force her to run now. "Fine. Hold the left flank. Don't pull the trigger unless you see the whites of their eyes. We're low on brass." The shootout dragged on in the murky blizzard. Gideon and Cassidy moved with an eerie rhythm. He picked off the long-range targets, while she kept anyone from rushing them out. Between the gunshots and the howling wind, a silent connection formed, a handoff of their very lives without a single word. But the numbers were too high. As their ammo ran dry, Gideon realized they'd be boxed in if they kept playing defense. He looked at Cassidy, seeing her shoulders shivering from the cold, though her hands remained rock steady. "We have to counterattack," Gideon said, his breath heavy. "They won't expect us to charge out into the storm. It's our only play. I'm with you." Gideon nodded. He wrapped a cloth around his hand and grabbed the last keg of powder. "When I throw this, you run like hell for the old wagon at the foot of the slope. Don't look back." He lit the fuse, counted to 3, and hurled the keg toward the pines where the leader was holed up. An explosion larger than all the others combined tore through the night, creating a massive pillar of fire. While the enemy was still dazed, Gideon grabbed Cassidy's hand and pulled her straight into the blizzard. They ran like madmen through a hail of parting shots. Cassidy felt the heat from Gideon's hand the first time he'd held her that tight. It wasn't about possession, it was absolute protection. When a bullet grazed Cassidy's shoulder, making her stumble, Gideon immediately spun around, firing 3 times to cover her. They reached the old wagon at the base of the mountain. Gideon shoved Cassidy into the back and leaped into the driver's seat. He snapped the reins, and the team of horses bolted, neighing as they charged down the snow-covered path. "Are you okay?" Cassidy asked, her voice cracking as she saw Gideon's shoulder soaked in blood. "Tend to your father," he snapped, though his eyes constantly darted to the mirror to make sure no shooters were on their tail. In the shadows of the wagon, Cassidy hurriedly tore a strip of cloth to patch Gideon up. When she touched his wound, he gave a slight shiver, but didn't push her away this time. The silence between them held a different weight, now no longer a cold distance, but the vast sorrow of 2 souls who had just stepped back from the brink. Gideon, Cassidy whispered when she finished bandaging him. Back in the cave, you saved me again. You say you're a ghost, but ghosts don't have hearts that beat that fast. Gideon kept his eyes fixed ahead, where the lights of Vanderbilt Nash's manor began to flicker through the snow. My heart's thumping from the adrenaline, nothing else. Don't go mixing up survival with caring. His words were still cold, but Cassidy saw his hand on the reins tremble slightly. She knew he was lying. He was scared not of dying, but of the life starting to stir inside him because of her. They didn't head back to Bitterroot. Gideon steered the wagon onto the west road, aiming straight for Nash's estate. "What are you doing?" Cassidy asked, worried. "That's his den of iniquity. Defense never wins against men like Nash," Gideon replied, his eyes burning with ironclad resolve. "We have the files, but he's got the green to buy off any judge who takes him. Only way to end this is to get his black ledger, the one that tracks every bribe. With that book, he won't have a single friend left in Montana." Nash's manor appeared like a lonely fortress on the hilltop. Light from the large glass windows shone brightly, defying the dark blizzard. Gideon stopped the wagon 100 yards from the main gate, hidden under thick brush. "Stay here with Mr. Miller," Gideon ordered, as he checked his daggers and his last few rounds. "If I'm not back in 15, drive straight for the Pony Express station up north. Get these files to the governor. Don't wait for me." Cassidy grabbed his hand, her eyes welling up but showing no weakness. "You have to come back. You still owe me an answer about who you really are." Gideon looked at her one last time. He made no promises. He only gave her hand a light squeeze, the only gesture he allowed himself to cross the line, then vanished into the whiteout. He crawled through the deep snow, approaching the stone walls of the manor. A cavalry scout's skill kept his movements silent. He scaled the second-storied balcony, where the window to Nash's study sat slightly ajar. Inside, Nash stood by the fireplace, sipping a glass of red wine. He looked as elegant and composed as if nothing had happened. On the mahogany desk sat a lone black leather-bound ledger. Gideon slid into the room like a shadow. But just as his hand touched the book, a cold barrel pressed against the back of his neck. "I told you, Vane." Nash's voice rang out with smug satisfaction as he slowly turned, wineglass still in hand. "Romantics usually end up in unmarked graves. And you're the biggest romantic I've ever met." Behind Gideon, Silas Reed, the yellow-bellied sheriff, stood smiling with pure malice. Silas Reed shoved the barrel of his sidearm into the nape of Gideon's neck, cold and menacing. Vanderbilt Nash took a sip of his wine, his eyes glinting under the hearthlight, showing the smug triumph of a man who believed he held the final piece of the puzzle. "You know, Vane," Nash said, setting his glass on the mahogany desk right next to the black leather ledger, "the biggest mistake men like you make is believing in gut justice. You really think you can just bust in here, snatch a few figures, and topple an empire? I'm the one who built the order in Bitterroot. I'm the man who brought the lights, the rails, and the future to this godforsaken wilderness." Gideon stood motionless, his breathing impossibly steady. He didn't look at Nash. Instead, he watched Silas Reed's reflection in the window pane as the blizzard battered the glass. "Your future was built on the bones of 15 families down in those shafts," Gideon said, his voice low but echoing through the opulent room. "And that ledger is the list of every man who helped you dig their graves." Nash gave a dry, raspy chuckle. "And who's going to read it? You? Or the Miller girl shivering under a wagon out there?" Gideon tightened his jaw. Nash knowing Cassidy's position wasn't unexpected, but it made his chest tighten just the same. "Read," Nash ordered, his eyes never leaving Gideon. "Take our guest down to the mine. I want him to see his handiwork firsthand before he becomes a permanent part of it. Oh, and don't forget the girl. I don't want any loose ends connecting back to the world." Silas Reed jammed the muzzle into Gideon's back, escorting him from the room. They led him down a service staircase through a dark corridor that opened directly into the Northern Star mine entrance, behind the manor. The snow fell thicker now, the wind wailing like the cries of buried souls. At the mine mouth, 2 other gunmen were waiting, dragging Cassidy and her elderly father from the wagon. Cassidy struggled, her green eyes blazing with pure hate when she saw Gideon held at gunpoint. "Gideon!" she screamed, her voice cracking in the storm. He looked at her, a fleeting gaze that carried a silent apology. He'd failed to make her run sooner. Inside, Silas Reed barked, shoving them all into the dark belly of the earth. The Northern Star mine was a labyrinth of makeshift timbers and the musty reek of damp earth. Dim torches illuminated the deep, hollow passageways. Nash followed last, his refined appearance looking wildly out of place in this death trap. He stopped at a wide clearing where the ground showed signs of fresh digging. This is where the copper vein is richest, Nash pointed beneath his boots. And where I keep Bitterroot's secrets. Reed, end this. I've got a victory breakfast in the morning. Silas Reed cocked his pistol, looking at Gideon with sadistic glee. I've been itching for this, Scarface. But just as Reed went to pull the trigger, Gideon spun. His movement was faster than the eye could follow. He didn't strike Reed first. Instead, he kicked the base of a large oil lamp sitting on a crate nearby. The lamp shattered, flaming kerosene spilling across the floor and creating a sudden wall of fire between Gideon and the henchman. In the chaos, Gideon pulled the dagger hidden in his sleeve and whipped it straight into the throat of the gunman holding Cassidy. "Run, Cassidy! Get your father to exit 4, Gideon roared, lunging at Silas Reed. Gunshots thundered in the cramped mine, creating ear-splitting echoes. Gunsmoke mixed with the kerosene fumes, turning visibility to zero. Gideon tackled Reed to the ground, the two of them rolling through the muck and shale. The strength of a former cavalry scout took over. Gideon used Reed's own gun butt to smash the corrupt sheriff's jaw, knocking him cold. On the other side, Cassidy didn't run. She snatched up the gun from the fallen henchman. She knew she couldn't let Gideon fight alone. As Nash tried to draw a small derringer from his coat pocket, Cassidy fired. The bullet grazed Nash's arm, making him drop the gun, his elegant face twisting in pain and terror. You little bitch," Nash howled, clutching his bleeding arm and backing away toward a stack of dynamite crates prepped for the next blast. Gideon stood up covered in mud and blood. He approached Nash but didn't fire immediately. He pulled something from his vest that Nash didn't expect, the black ledger. He'd nicked it during the scuffle in the office before Reed had subdued him. "This book doesn't just have the names of county officials," Gideon said, his breath heavy. "It's got your under-the-table deals with the federal senators, too. I already sent a copy of the land files to the governor via the express rider, but this ledger is the thing that's going to put you on the gallows." Nash looked at the book, then into Gideon's unblinking hazel eyes. He knew he'd lost. The kingdom he'd built was crumbling like a house of cards in a gale. "You think you won," Nash laughed maniacally. "If I go down, Bitterroot goes with me. This mine is the town's lifeblood." "This vein was fed on blood," Gideon replied coldly. "Time for it to stop pumping." Suddenly, a structural groan rumbled from deep within the mine. The support timbers, already rotten and weakened by the blast and the fire, began to snap. Rocks rained down from the ceiling. "The mine's coming down," Cassidy screamed, running over to grab Gideon's hand. "We have to go now." Gideon looked at Nash. The most powerful man in Bitterroot was now just a pathetic wretch, pinned between the rubble of his own ambition. Gideon didn't kill him. He simply turned his back, pulling Cassidy and helping Mr. Don't Miller toward the faint light of the entrance. "Gideon, don't let him get away," Cassidy cried as she saw Nash trying to crawl after them. "He ain't going nowhere," Gideon replied. "This mine's going to be a tomb for him and his ledger. The truth is already out, the rest is up to the law." They burst out of the entrance, just as a bone-jarring crash shook the earth. The entire mouth of the Northern Star mine collapsed, taking a portion of Nash's manor with it. Dust and snow swirled into a massive cloud, burying every trace of the brutality within. Dawn began to break over the Bitterroot horizon. The pale light of a new day pierced through the haze, shining over the white fields. The storm had broken, leaving behind an eerie stillness. At the Miller farm, Cassidy watched as local miners and farmers helped her father set the first fence post back in place. News of Nash's confession and the bribed officials had swept the county. Federal authorities had arrived to oversee the return of land to the remaining 11 families. Justice had finally come home, though the price was scars that would never truly heal. Cassidy saw Bones standing under the old pine tree, but Gideon was nowhere to be seen. She ran to the gate, where he was cinching his saddlebags. "Are you really leaving?" she asked, her voice heavy with a sadness she couldn't mask. Gideon paused, looking at the girl who had walked through the valley of death with him. In the morning light, Cassidy looked beautiful and far more grown up than the girl he pulled from the fire. "My work here is done," he said, his voice flat but carrying a hint of softness. "Bitterroot needs folks like you to rebuild. I don't belong in places with steady roofs." "Where do you belong, Gideon Vane?" He looked toward the southern peaks, where the trail vanished into the horizon. "I belong to warm barrels and nameless roads. That's how I stay topside." Cassidy stepped closer, reaching up to lightly touch the scar on his cheek. This time he didn't pull away. "I used to think I loved you because you were a hero, but now I know I love you because you're the most haunted man I've ever met. Stay with us. My father needs a good smith and I." Gideon gently took her wrist, slowly but firmly moving her hand from his face. "You don't love me, Cassidy. You love the ghost of the man who saved you. Save that heart for someone who can look at you every morning without seeing the shadows of the past." He mounted up and Bones gave a soft nicker. Gideon looked at her one last time, his hazel eyes showing a rare, fleeting spark of warmth. "Hold on to this." He tossed her a spent brass shell casing. "Remind Thomas that sometimes asking the right question is more important than pulling the trigger." "Gideon!" Cassidy shouted as he spurred his horse. "Will you ever come back?" Gideon didn't look back. He only raised a hand in a silent salute. His silhouette grew smaller until it vanished into the mountain mist of the Montana high country. Cassidy stood there for a long time, clutching the brass casing in her palm. She knew she'd never see him again, but she also knew that whenever she saw smoke rising from a distant ranch or heard a gunshot echo in a stormy night, she'd remember the man named Gideon Vane, the man who had no home but gave everyone else theirs back.